computer. Okay, we're back. Part 2. So we're going to talk about gameplay, how it felt to play certain elements and big story beats. So that's what we're going to talk about here.
Yes.
First question. Why is this a part 2 and not a sequel? What do you think about this?
Sorry. So I remember having this conversation about The Godfather Part 2 in college when that was, we were film students and everything. And my buddy was like, well, it is a part 2. It's a continuation. And it was such a reflection of the original that I guess you could make that argument in the case of The Godfather. And in this one, I don't know. To be honest, I think it's kind of semantic. They just couldn't call it The Last of Us 2 because that just doesn't sound right. But if you want to sort of go in that direction, and titles are very important to me. I think about them a lot. But if you do, I think an argument could be made in terms of like the paternal child aspect that the sequel sort of mirrors the parent-child relationship. But I don't know. What have you been thinking about this?
I guess I think about sequels in terms of like, is it with the same character but a completely different story? So if I think about Uncharted, we're following Nathan Drake the entire way through, but really each of the stories or each of his quests are completely different. And so I feel like that's a sequel. Whereas this one, while the quest is different because now you have Ellie, it's so tied to the first one and everything is as a result of the end of the first one. That's why I feel like it does serve well as a part 2.
Yeah.
That's kind of where I come from. I was actually thinking, what if they made this huge game where it's part 1 and it goes all the way into part 2 and you just sit there for 40 hours, I guess, and play that.
That would be intense. That's eventually they did that for The Godfather. They have The Godfather Saga, which they air on AMC sometimes, which puts everything in chronological order. But yeah, I could see that. But when they make the TV show, I think obviously the first game will be season 1, second game will be season 2. But yeah, certainly the narrative flows right together. And there's a lot of flashbacks, and the second one sort of connecting it back. Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think they're going to change it for part 3. If there is one, they won't just,
right.
Last of Us 3.
That would be weird.
Though, I mean, I have an idea of what they could do, and I feel like it would be closer to a 3 rather than a part 3. But anyways.
We'll have to talk about that.
So what sorts of callbacks are there to part 1? Are there any? Are they successful?
So in being a reflection or an echo of the first, there's a lot of deconstruction, which I think was sort of subtextual in the first game. A lot of the violence that went on is remarked upon in the second one. And so it kind of becomes text, the way that Mass Effect 3 does for the first 2 games. These things that were just a part of the narrative are now being commented on. There's a moment early on where you talk about the torture scene that happened in the first game, which Ellie eventually does in the aquarium, the mark it on the map situation. And of course, there's all the flashbacks to baby Ellie in her times with Joel post the events of the first game, which are very heart-touching, heartwarming. So yeah, I think those are, I guess for me, the major points.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I think that a lot of the callbacks are successful. Especially, it's interesting to get Ellie's point of view of certain events that happened from the first game when you're walking around with Dina in Seattle day 1, and she talks about Bill because you're encountering all of those tripwire traps. And that really feeds in well because she says, Bill had this whole town, and she goes into that history. And then, talking about you don't, sometimes it's easier to not worry about anyone or, be a burden. And Dina's like, yeah, I guess you're right, in like a weird tone of voice. And you don't realize, oh, well, now it's because she's pregnant, because then there's that escalation and moment between the two, a not nice moment. And you get a sense of where that was coming from. Or the torture scene, as you said, or Joel, because several people ask, why do you think they went after Joel? And she knows now to a certain extent, but she says, I don't know. He had so many enemies, and would talk about his days as what were those called? Just survivors or scavengers? Or
specifically, he was a smuggler.
Yeah. Yep. And then he was also one of those people in Pittsburgh from the first game as well. So just that he has, he's not the squeaky clean person. I think that I think players held him up to be, honestly, in the first game, because you do like him, even though he's really gruff and everything. So I think you get a sense also that she might be a bit blind as to who Joel is. And I think that informs her character journey to a
Yeah.
certain extent. And then there are like wonderful little details, like the robot toy that she got for Sam is in her little hotel, her
Oh.
room, little things like that, which are really nice. So the first big hit, of course, is that Joel dies,
Mhm.
and he dies rather early on. Do you feel like Joel's death was inevitable in terms of the Last of Us story?
I don't know. I feel like the ways in which death is sort of utilized in narratives is kind of like as an escape to really deal with a lot of the ramifications of things. And usually it's just like when characters sort of outlive their purpose in the narrative. And I wouldn't say that. I mean, I think that part of the reason why the death was so effective for us is that there was a lot left unresolved with Ellie and Joel. And so it comes, it's so sudden. But I think in terms of a broader sort of cosmic idea that like was this sort of like karma or karmic in nature. And I think that that's as a reflection of the world. Certainly, yes. I mean, everybody in this game has a ghost that is sort of chasing them, and they eventually sort of fall prey to it. So inevitability. I don't know. I mean, is that kind of a recurring theme in this game? And I don't know. What I mean, did you think that it was inevitable?
I thought that he was going to die. I thought it was probably going to be at the end in like a self-sacrificial way. So when it
Oh,
happened so early, I was rather shocked. And so then I was trying to figure out, why did I think he was going to die? And I felt, I guess I personally thought that if he did die, it was going to be on behalf of Ellie. And in a way, I suppose he did for Ellie. Just like the way that you think about the preposition for might be a little bit different, but it was his actions, that brought it about. So I think it goes to your, universe karmic sort of thing that he's paying. But if you look at all these flashbacks, if you were to go in narrative time order, it seems like everything's fine, like
yeah.
as happy an ending as you could get for him. And I think, um, I don't know that he necessarily regrets any of the things that he does, or, it's all in his past. He certainly doesn't regret what he did at the hospital, because we see that in
Right.
that final cutscene between them. And that's just his past, and he's lived through it. And you have to do, like he says, to test, right? We're survivors tests. And so perhaps maybe it wasn't inevitable that he was going to die, and that's why it is so shocking, because you think he survived all of this. He went cross country with this little girl. He's this gruff guy. He survived falling on a piece
Oh,
of steel. um, so perhaps it's not. But yeah, maybe the universe has ordained that it would be so.
the universe as dictated by Neil Druckmann.
I guess, yeah.
Those flashbacks really hit hard because I agree that he doesn't regret it, but I think it's such a complicated situation because
It
a lot
is.
of those, or I mean, at least two of the flashbacks kind of end with Ellie questioning him again, bringing this up, and so it's this weird sort of depiction of like an afterlife of the original game where it's like it is this happy ending, but it is so tainted by
Mm-hmm.
the lie that he told and this thing that he did, and he kind of can't live out the perfect life that he had, with Sarah back in the day because the cruel realities of this Last of Us world, and so man, it's really it's rough, and massive kudos to Troy Baker, the actor. Obviously, he's taking a reduced role in the game, but like to sort of portray the complexities and he's very guarded. He's trying not to say certain things and also maintain this sort of tough guy dad facade that he's now taking on this role for Ellie. I mean, it's quite a performance.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, when he rides to Salt Lake City, when he finds her at St.
Oh,
Mary's Hospital, and he like gets off and like grabs her into a hug right away. You're like, wow, this man has come so far.
yeah,
And it's, I mean, even after his death, and you visit his house and you see he's taken up woodworking.
yep,
He's creating all these statues, he's building guitars. He's got a book by his nightstand of, I think it's like Space for Dummies or something like that, because Ellie has such a love for space and things like that. And so you see, yeah, his development. But you're right that I also love those scenes because you can see how much that doubt that I feel like you can see on her face, even though it is ambiguous from the end of the first one, that it's really played and plagued her as well. And yeah, because the birthday scene is so great. I think that's what people call the giraffe moment when they're in the capsule, the space capsule, and he got her the Apollo 11, I think, launch audio. And then afterwards you're separated and you're like poised for a fight with something. They're giving you materials together as if you're going to encounter something and it's just a bore or whatever. And then you turn around and there's that firefly symbol on the wall and like the tone completely shifts from that. And then Joel's like, well, better get out of there. And then you can tell that their relationship starts to get strained from then. She doesn't talk to him as much. They go to get guitar strings or attempt to, and they find those two runaways from Jackson that tried to help out the world. And there's the altercation there of like, why, who else have you seen that's not that is immune, and yeah, so I feel like and that article we had read, kind of poo-poos these backflashes, but or flashbacks, but I feel like it really adds a lot of dimension to what Ellie was going through in these spaces. And it's so complicated. Her relationship with him is so complicated, because I think she does have maybe hate for him, but she also has this love and regard, and then it's tainted. And Venge Quest, man alive, it's so complicated for sure.
Well, so, I mean, for me,
you got no.
Well, for me in the original game, it was the part that was unambiguous was that she would have consented to being killed for the purpose of reason. Because she's, I mean, one of my favorite lines in that game, which is in one of the trailers, is like, after everything we've been through, everything that I've done, it can't be for nothing. And like the way that Ashley Johnson says that, like the tremble in her voice, she's like, oh my God, that's so powerful. And so, yes, like she would have absolutely been willing to have sacrificed herself. And so what those flashbacks sort of get to is this like buried wound. And it's like, you're just barely scratching it amidst this like very, very like touching father-daughter moments. And it's just, man, yeah, it's interesting. I remember, like a game you've already mentioned, Shadow of the Tomb Raider, you have a flashback where you play as baby Lara, and like I don't even remember what the purpose of that was. Like it just comes out of nowhere. But I was immediately reminded of that. But there's so much more going on here.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think through that you can also, even though she really helps the community of Jackson, you can kind of get that sense from other characters talking to her and about her. I feel like, she lives her life purposeless.
Right.
I think she hasn't found her ultimate purpose. And it's interesting thinking about that great line from the trailer versus one of the Abby flashbacks where she interrupts Marlene and her father and says, if it was me, I'd want you to kill me as well. So, yikes.
And also something Abby says at the theater when she's confronting Ellie, she says, I let you live and you wasted it, which was that was so gut-wrenching.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And do you feel like these flashbacks and seeing Ellie's turmoil, does that almost portray Joel more negatively from the end of the last game, would you say? Because I think people were on board. I mean, as a player, I was on board of like, I love these two. I don't want Ellie to die. Even though morally, as a human being, I'm like, wow, you just doomed us all. But do you think that shades it a little bit now that we know what her feelings are on the subject? Because it kind of took away her agency.
Oh, absolutely. Which is kind of where a bit the abortion thing was in. And now that I'm looking back at the original game and people's reaction to it, I kind of get that because, he dooms mankind to save, but like that's so abstract, especially before the coronavirus, an apocalypse on that scale. And so I understand why people would only sympathize with Joel and Ellie, but that wasn't really necessarily my reaction. It was just a lot more complicated. And so I think what the flashbacks did in part 2 is it honestly kind of made Joel seem a bit more pitiable to me for some strange reason. And I don't know that I can really back that up, but that was just the impression I was getting, that like this is the world that he made and now he has to live in it. And then for Ellie, yeah, I mean, it's heartbreaking for her because, of course, there's that great dramatic irony that we know what happened, but she is like piecing it together. And I didn't think that she was going to figure it out in a flashback. I thought that it was going to come from Nora or somebody like that in the present day. But yeah, yeah, Shades definitely, adds more complications for sure.
Absolutely. Yeah. And yeah, you just feel bad for her because she had nothing to do with it, but she's
Yeah,
got to live it out. And so I think it also just tells about how toxic and terrible and damaging lies are to a relationship too. And you'd think it was an innocuous little lie, but actually it wasn't. It changes everything. It really, yeah, affects it. So I did mention hate, and Neil Druckmann originally said that this game was about hate. I'm going to question it. Do you think it is? Is it about hate?
well, is the first game about love?
Hmm.
um I don't know, because I think certainly I think hate is kind of like your starting point for this game. And just as love is kind of subverted and perverted by the end of the first game, I think hate is definitely deconstructed by the end. And that is definitely the project of this game. The mission is to look at it and to look at violence and think more critically based on just gaining more perspective. And certainly we can talk about that as the primary thrust of the game. But yeah, it's interesting that he laid that out. I mean, do you think that that was a smart sort of on ramp for gamers to sort of grapple with the themes?
Yeah. I remember when I heard that, I thought, I wonder if I'll be able to take this game
Yeah,
because if the first one is about love and there are some really traumatic things that go on in that game, I was thinking, yikes, what is the flip side of that? What does that
right.
look like? And I mean, it's even interesting, and we'll talk about her development, but to have the character that, I laugh now, but when Joel killed somebody, she's like, shit, Joel,
Yeah.
like, ooh, what are you doing? To then seeing one of those gameplay trailers and you're like, oh my gosh, what has happened?
Yeah.
I think to a certain extent it is, but I also think that love is still the underlying theme, because would she have done this if she didn't love Joel? Like if he was, if she really did hate him for what he did, which I think she still has some grievances with that, would she have gone on this epic venge quest? Is that what they're called?
Bench
Um,
quest.
and then you have, her relationship with Dina. And then on the flip side, Abby, which certainly there was a venge quest right there at the beginning, but everything after that was not. And Abby and Yara and Lev and all of that. So I feel like while that might be like a piece of it, I think that love is still there. It might just be like a perverted form of it, or like it's transformed into this ugly thing, which makes you become obsessed with vengeance.
Right. That's the other thing too, is that it's a very complicated kind of love because I don't by the end of the game, I think we're not really supposed to be sympathetic to Ellie's love for Joel anymore, that it's ruining her life and her relationships, and it's driving her to continue to doggedly pursue this character that at least I had become very sympathetic with Abby.
Yeah. Yeah, I think on the like on the outside as a player, because of course you have this when you're in the game, but then as a player, I also felt like it was subtly a game about empathy, that
Mm,
you are thrown in very uncomfortably playing this character that you have no idea who it is. I remember the first playing it, it's just woman and man as you're following
yeah.
Owen, and they're like, okay, this Abby, why am I playing as Abby? You learn the majority of combat first from her, which was very bizarre. And then as things were getting closer, I was thinking, oh my gosh, please do not make me play as her as she's killing Joel, like doing the button presses, which that would have been masochistic
Yeah. I
if
wonder if that
that
was
were
ever a
true.
part during the development cycle.
Yeah, because you do it with Nora, and so yikes,
Oh
that
yeah.
would have been pretty
God.
bad. So no, I don't like Abby, and then I'm playing for a long time as Ellie. I think the game is over. What? Now I'm playing as Abby again, and initially I was very uncomfortable. Day one, I didn't like it as much, but then oh, I'm starting to like Abby. I'm starting to like the companions she's with. I'm starting to better understand. So as a player, I think unless you're like really closed-minded and you fell into the trap on, that I'm going to hate this game, you begin to feel empathy towards this character that may have, killed off someone that you really loved. So I felt like that was finally crafted. And I really liked Abby. I mean, to a certain point, I mean, there were times that I may have been batting for her and over Ellie, which because of some of the stuff that was happening. So I feel like that's great. I mean, when a game can do that, can take someone like a villain, which we can talk about that, of course, and then all of a sudden makes you like that person, sort of forces you gently, was, yeah, very interesting.
There's actually, for my part, there is a bit of a precedent for this game in Halo 2, which is a game from 2004, where you do play as not the villain or anything like that, but a sort of a hidden villain from the first game. You play as the enemy alien, and you learn his story, and he becomes sympathetic, which I just think is so wonderful. But in this game, I feel like I was getting those vibes, especially since you play as Ellie or Abby in the beginning, and then so you think maybe she's coming back. That'll be a really weird non sequitur. And then when she did, and it was Seattle Day One, my reaction was similar but a bit more intense. I was like, oh my god, no! I can't have another entire game because I have a deadline. It appeared crass to me, because one of the least effective parts of this game was when you're in gameplay shooting people and they're like, Gary, Bill, Donovan. I don't know
they
why
were proud of that. All the developers, that was like, now you know, because these people are not nameless.
Yes, they certainly are not. Patricia, Jason.
Oh my god!
I thought that was so over the top, but I think that Abby segment did eventually. It was starting to win me over because I didn't really like Owen, off the bat. I liked Manny, and then Mel was kind of a non-entity for me. But it was actually when Lev started to come in and Yara that it was like, I realized that was, for the first time, it was giving me the same experience as the first game, which is characters slowly coming together. Whereas the relationships were already established with her and Owen from the beginning, and I didn't care as much.
Yeah.
But once you were crossing the bridge with Lev, and Abby was really like getting like involved emotionally, and like she was scared. It was like, oh my gosh, this is The Last of Us. And that was like hour 18. So
yeah.
it took a long time for me to get there, but I did get there.
Yeah. I will say that the last playthrough I did with the Rattlers, there were 3 Mateos that I killed for some reason.
Really?
So it's like, Mateo! And then later, Mateo! Wow, 3 Mateos all in one group. I couldn't believe it.
Oh my god.
That's interesting. Though we'll talk about the dogs, I think. So we're saying villains and heroes and things like that. Are there? So we were told that there weren't. There were no heroes, right. No villains. Do you agree with this?
I think that's something that people say a lot in messaging around media stuff. They also say this is going to be the dark second chapter. I think I heard that about everything released in the mid 2000s. But for this game, I honestly think that it could have benefited from a little bit of not moral black and white, but a bit of camp almost, because you have that character Emily, who I didn't even know who that she had a name, but yeah. When you have that moment of emotional climax inside the game, you're just killing another Emily. Whereas I feel like if characters were sort of built up to be not villains but taking on that role, I think you could have had a bit more, I don't know, stakes or something. Like, yeah. I mean, functionally, you don't know much about Lev's mother before you find her dead and things like that. But that's just, it goes to the perspectives and the limited, third person objective POV of video games like these. But I don't know. I don't think they were heroes or villains. What do you think?
I'm always suspicious of it because Vanity Fair is known as, by William Makepeace Thackeray, is known as a novel without any heroes, and I feel like I can actually find a hero character in there, and so it's just interesting. And I guess there is no black and white. This whole thing is very gray. While I feel like Abby turns out to be maybe a bit higher on like the humanity scale than Ellie, at the end, I couldn't necessarily call her a hero. But what I like about this game though is that the first game, it seems like all the groups you run up against, maybe with the exception of David's group, though we've talked to, like, you kind of have to like squint your eyes a bit, seem like pretty crappy people. Right. And that you're clearly on the side of Joel, and with I guess the Fireflies would be an exception. But right. With this one, the wolves, they seem bad. when you're as Ellie, but as Abby, it's like, oh, well, I'm thinking about their belief system, and there are people there too. And even the Seraphites, uh, I think we'll have a discussion on them,
Yeah.
but even they, they're not, they are misled, I think, by their current leaders, but they're not like terrible people. So it seems like a lot of these groups have more depth to them, I think, than the previous game, which I do like. Because you think about, when you are Joel and you're like a mass murderer in the first one,
Yeah.
killing all these groups. So what do these people think? And when you run up against David, you get that sense of like, yeah, a bunch of my people that were foraging were killed by a man who was with a girl. And you're like, oh yeah, that's the other side of it, isn't it? So you wonder what that's like. What is it like for the Seraphites or the Wolves when you've got two teenagers or young adults killing all of your people? What's that like? So I do like that you get a different side to the conflict, but I would agree that there aren't any straight heroes or villains. But I would say, villain wise, the Rattlers, can you give them any positive credit, do you think?
I mean, it's hard because you build up this idea that everybody has sides, but then you end with like this. I mean, they were like slavers.
Yeah.
I mean, it follows a similar arc as The Wire, actually, that you have, drug organizations that you understand, and then you end with this ultra violent gang that it's difficult to be more sympathetic to. And with the Rattlers, yeah, I mean, I had, you know, zero compunctions about killing all those Mateos. So yeah,
Oh my gosh. Yeah. I mean, anyone who comes and gets you without any provocation, I think, is an issue, because Abby and Lev
right,
were just leaving the garage and then all of a sudden they were taken down.
yeah,
Well, this is going to be a huge, huge talking point, I think. The violence
yeah,
in this game. And I will say that I'm not a prude when it comes to violence in video games. I've played Shadow of the Tomb Raider. Even more, probably God of War series, which is like gratuitous. But even
yes,
with that, I mean, you're ripping heads off of Medusas. This is real life violence. And I was reminded of, there's a boss battle with a giant Seraphite guy at the end of
oh,
when you're on the island, and it is really rough. She like rips open his jaw, and it's, whoo boy. And there
yeah.
were times I had to look away with some of the stuff that was going down. But how does this compare to the first game? Do you think it's just that we've jumped generations and so we have more freedom to make it more violent? Do you think it came with the storyline and it had to be violent because we're talking about violence here and a cycle of violence? And what are your thoughts? Is it gratuitous? So I'm just throwing out a bunch of questions for you to see how you respond to any of these. So take it however you want.
You could see me. I'm near
I know
catatonia,
I
just sitting, reflecting on the violence. Um, I mean, I never played remastered, so I don't know if like this is what they were shooting for all along. But
Mm,
certainly, with higher graphical fidelity, there is the option, at least, to make things. When necessarily you reach for verisimilitude, and you saw this with the new Call of Duty game, of course, because these games are just founded on violence, that you're going to get more realistic violence. But where Last of Us differs from Call of Duty, of course, is that is sort of baked into the themes. They're grappling with these things. So I think maybe it was kismet, maybe it was not, but I think it makes sense that the game is as violent. I don't remember the original Last of Us as like an over the top violent game. And the comparison to God of War is important because I think your level of acceptability when it comes to violence is in part based on the context of that violence. It's the old like RoboCop Fight Club lesson that like you have these ultra violent movies, and then the MPAA steps in. They're like, okay, you got to edit this stuff out. And when you take out the absurdity level, it actually becomes more grim, even
mm.
though there's less physical violence on screen. And so there's a narrative component inherent to any discussion of violence. And so I don't know, is this sort of the last house on the left of video games? Is it so violent so that we are confronting it? Maybe, yes. And I think that's inevitably part of a greater discussion.
Yeah. I've seen a couple places, and I saw one recently on social media. I'm not sure which form, but I think it was a young lady said, how much she loves The Last of Us, but she had to stop playing The Last of Us Part 2 because it was just too much. And I mean, honestly, I could see it. I
Yeah.
feel like the first one, because I recently replayed it, I had watched Donovan play it. There are certainly really tense and brutal moments, but also the camera does not show a lot. So when
Yeah.
Joel is beats that guy to, I guess maybe it's just one hit, I can't remember, in the garage, you only see Joel. With Ellie shellacking, that's probably not a word, macheting David, you see the machete in the blood, but you don't see his head as a pulp. But with this, we do not shy away from a lot of things. We don't see Nora, which is good because I think that would be bad.
Yeah.
But I mean, you see Joel to a certain extent. Some of these Seraphite boss battles with Abby are really horrendous.
Yeah.
Like I said, there are some things I had to look away because it was too much. And I think there might be, I would hope that someone want to do it just because, you know, God of War, I think it is just cause. I mean, that's Kratos. Kratos
Right.
is a really violent individual and he will beat people and, you know, punch them out and their face and all that stuff. But with Ellie going from shit Joel to this is a hard take. And so I think it's meant to show, like, number one, potentially her character decline, but also just like the results of violence and like the obsession with it, and like look at what it has created and what it's done to the characters. um yeah. I so you would say that it's probably not gratuitous then?
Uh, I I think for the most part, yes.
Okay.
It's hard for me because I'm kind of a gorehound when it comes to movies, but I have sort of shuddered in the past at the level of violence going on in video games, which is just personal taste. It's not like I'm not judging or anything, Mr. Mika Judgy over here. But you know, in The Last of Us Part Two, certainly there's also, again, with the narrative, like when you kill Mel, I mean, that was like, oh, it was really hard
Yeah.
because you had a bit of characterization for her already.
Mm-hmm.
And she was definitely the one character who was like not okay with killing Joel. And so that was in the back of your head the whole time, and incredibly powerful is certainly Ellie's reaction at the end. I think she throws up.
Yeah.
And so, you know, whether or not that could be accomplished with less violence, probably, yeah. But at the same time, I mean, it sucks because if it means that at least one player couldn't finish the game, then maybe mission not accomplished. I remember certainly being horrified by the first gameplay reveal of Ellie. Like I posted about it on Facebook. I was like, this is too much. And now playing the game, it didn't really have that same effect, but yeah, it is a lot. This is a very violent game for sure.
It is. Yeah. I remember seeing that trailer, the second one, with the Seraphites, and I don't know that I became ill, like the writer of the article, whom I can't remember, but just like when that hammer was coming down on Yara, I was like, this is, wow, what's
Yeah.
happening? This is what it's going to be like, isn't it? I think there's a lesson potentially to be learned from that. But it is hard to watch. I think it gets into this idea, which I've got this theme all over the place on these notes, but you as Ellie versus you as a player. And I mean, we can talk about it a bit now, but in other contexts, just like doing things that you wouldn't really want to do, and you have to make choices. So do you want to do stealth and potentially avoid combat encounters, which is possible? Do you want to kill dogs so that they don't have the trail, like, which sounds awful? And then, yeah, some of and you know, we're focusing a lot on big moments in the gameplay, but there are also, like, I used those explosive arrows a lot. And if once I finished, like, if you would look around at how awful it looks of like these exploded bodies, is pretty terrible. I feel less bad when it's a shambler and I've blown it up,
Right.
you know, and there are chunks there. But yeah, it's just like, oh gosh, all of this stuff. And you did it. You did it. You chose to do it. Which I think is really interesting. So I feel like there's maybe like a meta narrative. I never know if I use that correctly, but you know, you've got this story, but then what does that say about you as a person, that this is the route that you chose to go and you are forced to do things? I asked at one point, or I may have clicked something and asked you, I wonder what would happen if you didn't push square to hit Nora. And I waited for a good amount, but you have to
Yeah.
the story progress. And you have to do it 3 times, unfortunately. So it's interesting. Yeah. What you are forced to do, what you might choose to do, to kill the Mateos of the world.
And that was part of the conversation in the last game too, because you had to kill Abby's father, Dr. Anderson, who we did not know whose name was,
Yeah.
but you didn't have to kill everybody else in the room,
No.
and I did not. But that was definitely a sticking point in the discourse, because video games are supposed to be about choices, and The Last of Us was like, this is Joel's story. And for this one, the gameplay, like I was pretty adept at stealthing my way through the first Last of Us. This one, I was basically, there was no encounter where I successfully got to the door where you would close it and be like, okay, now that means nobody's gonna come. I left everybody dead. It was horrible. And that was my experience with the gameplay. It was like, I would try, I'd like, all right, let's sneak around. But because this is an open world stealth game,
Yeah.
I just cannot reconcile that at all. Like, I just like, okay, I see a space over there. I can go there, but they're going to see me from over there. They're going to see me from the building. I just get so mad that eventually I'm like, when that dog comes around, I'm going to kill that dog. And I got so angry that, and believe me, I love dogs. Like I had a dog when I was younger, and we had to say goodbye to him a few years ago. And it was one of the saddest moments of my life. But in this game, I was like, die dogs, death to dogs. I was killing dogs. I was killing people. And a lot of it too, there was a bit of, I don't know how you would even quantify this, like counter narrative, where the AI wasn't bad, but it was so funny because you would eventually play with it in stealth sequences where you would kill somebody stealthily behind like a cabinet or something, and somebody would be alerted to it, and they'd say, "Oh, I got to search," and they'd come around, you know, rope a dope them, and you'd kill them in the exact same spot. And I, at least 2 occasions, I'd leave like bodies of people, and I was like, yeah, this is not this is Schindler's List. This is not.
Oh boy. Yeah, the dogs were pretty bad. I would say that the worst killing of a dog I had was Bear.
Yeah,
If only because afterwards you find out who Bear was. So that
that
was
was
rough.
yeah, that was rough.
Mm-mm-mm. Um, okay. How does this game then, since we know that it is uber violent, how does it balance grotesque or brutal and the beautiful, or does it?
I think it was, you could argue for the museum flashback being the giraffe moment, and they call back to it in that scene. But I think that there's just a lot of beauty throughout, even in those dark moments. You're very vertical in this game. You're often looking over across these huge ruined cityscapes and seeing the ways in which water, like the streets have become waterways, and it's just I don't know how that's going to hold up to the test of time, because The Last of Us Part Two, for all its resolution or whatever, it is not photoreal, although it's very very close. But obviously, the next Naughty Dog game is going to make this look like $5. It's just the nature of things. So I don't know if that beauty will be lost, but a lot of it goes to the art, the artistry, and the lighting and everything. And so I don't know if there were a lot of moments that really specifically called out like, oh, this is a really beautiful moment, like the giraffes in the first game. But I think throughout it was just it was a gorgeous, and I think the purpose that the beauty of the game served was to kind of underscore the melancholy that just ran throughout the whole thing.
Yeah, I think the flashbacks do a good job of balancing that, because when I was seeing all this stuff come out, I just thought, oh gosh, it's going to be one combat encounter after another. And there was still space, which I'm glad, like the first one. But because those combat encounters are so brutal, you need sort of a respite from it. And so I think those served the purpose well. I agree that the environments, I think, are really beautiful, even if they're horrifying, like the hospital or the tunnels when you're Ellie, which we'll talk about the hospital with that Rat King. And
uh,
then, not technically, I guess, beautiful, but at least there are the light moments, because, the first one you had the pun, no pun intended jokes, and you had certain conversations. And I thought, are they going to do that here? Can they do that here with all we've heard about? And they do a good job. Day one was much lighter for Ellie in tone than I thought it would be. You've got her picking up those superhero cards. You have Abby picking up the quarters. And so I think even though those are very small details and it's more like you're finding collectibles, I think it does give you space. And I think also beautiful moments, especially Abby's side, because once Ellie doesn't have any companions, it's really hard. Or even the ones she does, like Jesse, not as
Yeah.
much. But with Abby, and being with Yara, especially being with Lev, like that whole thing, and just the conversations between them, I thought was like really lightening the the burden of what I felt. And since you're Abby, what you know you're going to get into with all the stuff that's about to go down.
Mm.
Ay, ay, ay. Yeah. So since we've been talking about these flashbacks, let's talk about the narrative timeline. So it does not go from point A to point B, kind of goes back and forth. And then of course you have all of Ellie's story and then Abby's story and all of that stuff. Do you feel like that worked well with how they laid it out?
I think if you want to take a kind of academic look at the story, like when you were reading it out on Wikipedia, it's like it's very effective. When I was playing it, I was often frustrated because, I mean, just me personally, I have a hard time with like movies that don't have a narrative structure. Like I don't really like David Lynch movies, even something like The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, which I really, really like. It's so hard for me when I feel like I'm lost in a movie, which is just weird. And certainly in this game, like I just have no sense of like, is this the middle? Is this the end? Where are we? And so I just, that was kind of frustrating me on like a lizard brain level. And then when it comes to there's a lot of flashbacks in this game.
Yeah.
The forward momentum is just hobbled constantly, and that can also be kind of like literally frustrating. There's a Vietnamese movie called Fury, which is like a revenge movie, and so it's about this character who is going forward the whole time, but there's like constant flashbacks, like when she was a kid, and I'm like, why? We're just slowing down what's supposed to be forward motion. And so in part two, it can be frustrating, but I think it serves a purpose. And it's still kind of a novel thing to have flashbacks in a video game for me, because it's, I think in Metal Gear Solid 3 Snake Eater, if you screwed up in the past, because the whole game takes place in the past, you get like time paradox, because that, we know what happens in the present. So yeah, it's still it's interesting.
It's almost like Memento. Have you ever seen that film?
Oh yeah.
Which of course he can't remember really what's happening, but yeah, it reminds me of that. I'm kind of two minds. I think, like I said, the flashbacks alleviate some of the pain I was in emotionally of what was going on. I do agree that it halts forward momentum. I think the hardest change was going from Ellie to Abby.
Yeah.
Because you're really going back in time, and it works on a certain level, but it just felt like I'm playing another game. I felt like I was playing 4 games. If you got Ellie in the present, Ellie in the past, Abby in the present, Abby in the past.
Yeah.
And so I think to a certain extent, and I did end up liking the 1, 2, and 3 with Abby, because now you know the characters, which is interesting because the game spoils itself to a certain extent. Now you're
Right.
getting close to characters, they're going to die. And you see these neat intersections of something that Ellie did affecting Abby or vice versa. But it was just like a weird hard stop of, you've got this huge, what would you call it? Not altercation. Huge, what? See,
Confrontation.
confrontation. That's good. We'll go with that one. See, this is why the video is unedited, but the audio will be edited. This huge confrontation, and someone's going to die. And then there's bam, black screen.
Yeah.
And now you're day one, Abby. And that was really hard. That was a hard one to do. But I don't know. Could you think of another way to do it? Would you have gone day one, 2, 2, 3, 3? Could that have worked?
Ooh. I don't know, because I think that the space between the same moments in time give you a better opportunity to reflect. But you're right. I mean, it was a really hard, because especially once there are flashbacks nestled into the flashback, that is kind of when I start to get like, okay, a little antsy. But that's an interesting thought experiment. If they did do every other, that could have worked.
Yeah. Yeah, it'd be interesting if you could reorganize, or if they had like another release and did it in different order.
Yeah.
The locations, mostly in Seattle, But the first one moved around in the US. Were you okay staying mostly in Seattle? Of course, there's California at the end. You've got Jackson in the beginning. But were you okay with spending the bulk of the game in one location?
Yeah. I mean, I think when it comes to the aesthetics, there's a very consistent look to The Last of Us's world across multiple locations because everything's overgrown and decaying. There's a lot of breathtaking, like underpasses or whatever that are just completely crumbled and you just walk along. Um, but I was very concerned about locations in the game from a gameplay perspective because I know that all games these days are open world and I can't play those games. And so when you first start playing as Ellie proper and you go day one into Seattle looking for Tommy, I guess, and you come upon the first like open world segment, which is really the only one, I was fully expecting there to be a tooltip saying like, you know, mercenaries are around, do jobs for mercenaries to earn loyalty
Oh
points. I was
no.
fully expecting that, but thankfully there was no, the gamification I think is something that they really struggle with in the design of this game. And it felt very smooth. So I don't know if that's not really related to locations, but that was kind of my thoughts on it.
Gotcha. Yeah, I liked Seattle, and I'm glad that at least you went to different places. So you had the Seattle city center, maybe Seattle proper, and then you had a neighborhood and kind of the outskirts by the. So at least it was different. I did miss though, because part of the world of video games is escapism and getting to see different places. So,
That's true,
like
yeah.
Assassin's Creed Odyssey, which game we both love, you get to see across a Greek world and how different these places are. And so I would like to see as much of a post-pandemic US as possible. So that's my only, I think, negative thing is just that you got to see a bit more in Last of Us, where you had Boston and Pittsburgh and Seattle and all of that stuff. But this one, you're just relegated to one place. But
That's
narrative
true.
wise, it makes sense because I don't know why. I mean, it's Washington Liberation Front. They're not going to be moving other places. So,
That's true. I didn't think of that, but I think this game does have more dynamic, like discrete locations. Like there's an aquarium, there's the convention center, which you kind of just walk
yeah.
through. Very interesting, like locations like that.
Absolutely. Yeah. And a lot of it too, or several points, there are missable moments,
Yeah.
either in the open world aspect or even like a mini open world aspect. So, trying to think of one well, in that first big area, there's a music store. And if you go upstairs and play a guitar, you could sing Aha's Take Me On or Take On Me, and you could completely potentially miss that. I think also there's a queer bookstore, and so if you hang around, Dina finds a book and of like sorority sisters, and she's like, "That's us,
Oh,
isn't it?" So I mean, there are these little moments that are potentially missable for some people. Do you think that adds to the game, or is that like a bummer for people who miss it?
I think one of the critics that I really like in video games, although I don't know if they're necessarily still in video games, was Dave Riley, who talked about the Souls series, which you and I both have very limited experience with, Dark Souls, Bloodborne. But he mentioned that in Bloodborne, there's a moment where you just fall through like the world and end up in this underworld place, and it was such a moment of discovery that is so foreign to most video games, which are so interested in like this is the path, and we're just shuttling you along the path. And so I think certainly the missable moments have become a big talking point for marketing in games. That like, oh, this game is so big that you're gonna miss stuff. But I think it does add to that sense of like of world building, where the world is just so big that, as in real life, you're just not going to see everything, and so you kind of imagine what lies beyond. But the music store thing, like that was a long cutscene. I feel like I'm
Yeah.
shocked that people would have missed that.
Yeah. I guess if they never picked up the guitar, they're like, I've already played the guitar too many
Yeah.
times. Yeah, and it makes it more special too. Like if you found something, you're like,
Mm-hmm.
oh, look at this. That I could have just stumbled away and not have seen that. So that makes it a bit more fun. Um, yeah, and I think I'll save my open world discussion for the evolution of Naughty Dog because I think it gets a bit into that. Let us go to themes. What sorts of themes do you feel like this game has? I guess I could have put that near to the beginning, but here we are. What are the themes of this game?
Well, we start with hate, of
Mm-hmm.
course. We talked about that. Um, I think for me, the way I would approach this game, similarly to the last one, where The Last of Us is kind of like a short story with this really great hook. This one, the hook is much more elongated throughout the whole thing, where the premise of the game isn't again post-apocalypse or even revenge. It is empathy simulator, and so the hook comes Seattle Day One Abby, and you're
Mm-hmm.
like, oh, this is what the game is. Um, and so it's not necessarily a theme, but I think it's part of the moral or the point of the game that you are able to see a conflict from all sides. And whether or not that was successful, obviously we'll talk about. But I think for me, that's kind of the major point.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I would just add like cycle of violence, just that it could potentially be never ending, eye
Yeah,
for an eye makes the whole world blind sort of
literally.
situation. Yeah, unfortunately. Yeah. And just almost the power of a lie too,
Yeah.
because we can see that effect on them. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I do, in my notes I said bring in the classics references, but I can't help but think about dear old Achilles and the Iliad, and just how that all, because that would just spiraled out of control, with him losing one of his war prizes, refusing to fight. Then his cousin slash lover, sometimes lover, takes his armor and fights against Hector. Hector kills him. Now Achilles has got to do it's just terrible. It could never end. It could never end. Yeah, which we'll talk about, because does it end here? Who knows?
Right.
Representation of women and the LGBTQIA community. Does this do a good job to serve these communities and have good representations?
Um, I don't know, because it's one of those games where it's like, do you want to be represented in The Last of Us Part Two? It's like, because if you were, say, an Asian woman, there's that really graphic scene where you put a
Oh,
knife through one of their
Whitney.
throats. Yeah,
Yeah.
Whitney, who's playing you identified it as a PSP Go or a
Vita.
Vita.
Yeah.
Yeah, I thought it was just a PSP because I guess I didn't keep track of those handhelds, but um, yeah, I mean, when it comes to LGBTQ plus, I think obviously there's Lev, who is a trans man or boy, really, which is probably the first I'd ever seen in the game. LGBTQ plus representation is so minimal in mainstream games that it's sad. But I
Yeah.
mean, this felt like a major moment, and I personally really like Lev, and how he plays off of Abby. But I know that there's kind of been a mixed reception
Mm-hmm.
to those two representation in this game, as there has been for a lot of aspects of this game.
Yeah. Yeah. I think, with anything, you can't get it 100% right. I think that there's going to be some pushback on, some level. I know there's pushback on the L word, because not all lesbians look like that sort of thing. So I think that's probably going to happen. Yeah. With Lev, as far as I can tell, the negative pushback is because they used Lev's dead name,
Right.
Lily, which happens a couple times when you are with the Seraphites, which makes sense narrative wise, because it's not like the Seraphites are going to call him Lev. And then just I think the violence surrounding the whole thing, that it's certainly not an easy transition for him, and just like the world starts to crumble in on him, and just makes him and Yara villains almost from their perspective. So I feel like that those are the two main points.
Yeah.
You're right that there's not much representation. I know there's an upcoming game, though I can't remember what it's called, of twins, and one of them is a trans male. So at least we're taking steps, but I feel like that might be an indie.
Yeah.
So it seems like indie games have more freedom to have broader representation, whereas this is a triple A. So this was huge. Having that trailer with Dina and Ellie dancing and Kiss was like, oh my
Yeah.
goodness, what is this? So to have that at Naughty Dog, I think is great. And I know that Neil, because people asked him about it, or there was an interview, and he talked to the actor that played Lev, I knew his name. You scroll up. Ian Alexander, who shares a similar story, obviously not with the Seraphites, and a couple people that were on the crew, of course. So it's not like they were just coming up with an idea of this is what I would expect a trans character to be like. And then with Ellie, I felt like that's dealt with well, at least the lesbian aspect. I can see where the female protagonist could be problematic. But I mean, I don't know. We're in this terrible world. How great of, a characterization are you going to be able to get from that? And I think a problem that people might be running up against when you look at Ellie now is like comparing her to Last of Us 1, which we're going to do for sure, but does that kind of put you in a bad position of, well, if you're only looking at her there and she's a great side character and female young girl, compared to this who's really violent and is obsessed with violence and is pushing people away and making terrible decisions, then yes, that is a terrible representation. I think Abby, she's a well-rounded character as well. I know that they thought she was trans because of her body, but I like that. I mean, we'll talk about it, but I like that she is a female that we don't see very often, that sort of body type. But it may also go to, and we talked about this on the Birds of Prey episode on your own show, to what extent is that a female character, or like could you have just replaced her with a man and it would have been the same thing? So what sort of female aspects or characterizations that are distinctly female does Abby have? So I guess at first I thought, why are you so reticent that this is not a good representation of female? But I can see why it might not be. I think it's great the fact that we have two lead female protagonists, and we have other females dotted throughout, like Dina, or Maria, who's a strong, I mean, she's the leader of Jackson too. But yeah, are they the best representation of them? Maybe not.
I don't know. I see that point, sure, but it also kind of fizzles me out because a lot of the talking points around the strong female character discussion, which is more a discussion than an archetype, is, well, I don't want a strong female character. I want a complicated female character. And Ellie is very complicated. Yeah. Again, comparing her to Lara Croft in the reboot of the Tomb Raider games, which I really love, she's not a complicated character, which I'm fine with. I really like that character. But Ellie, there's just a lot going on, and with Abby as well. So I don't know how much is like a sort of essentially feminine in them, because I can't speak to that, and also it's kind of a worrying thought. Yeah. But I understand where that comes from too. But it's just like, yeah, that's frustrating. But with Lev also, I think one of the primary points of criticism that I saw was that there was the dead naming thing, but also that his expulsion from the Seraphites was because he was trans. And so it's like, well, do we have to sort of build that narrative in? Which, yeah, sure. Like, I get that. But I also think there's something to be said for the fact that after this like postmodern society that happens after one society has already fallen, is just repeating the sins of the past. It is homophobic because the last one was. And this is just what humanity will do, I guess, under certain circumstances, which is a very sort of cynical and maybe a limited perception of the world. But at the same time, we mentioned the industry abuse as it pertains to this conversation, because it's disappointing, because Naughty Dog is very bleeding heart liberal, especially in the AAA game space. I mean, Amy Hennig was the lead on 3 Uncharted games and a few other Naughty Dog games, I believe, and she's a woman, and that rarely happens. And Neil Druckmann and Bruce Stanley, they just seem so, they made a very sensitive game in The Last of Us. And so it's like, I give them a wide berth, I guess, of the benefit of doubt, I suppose.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, history repeats itself. So that's why I can sort of buy into the Seraphite, what happens there. And I can totally see, from because I'm a cisgendered woman, if I empathetically, I can see how that would be very uncomfortable playing that. But then you have to also look at Yara, see Yara's journey in accepting and loving her brother as well. And so I think there's a lot to be taken from that whole thing. Is there anything else about representation? I liked how you said, hours ago, I suppose, that there are so many different races of people and you kill every one of them.
Yeah. Well, I remember, I think Neil Druckmann had expressed some discomfort over the fact that Joel executes Marlene, who's a black woman, and he's a white guy at the end of the first game. And so I was keeping that in mind when you're chasing Nora down. And like, certainly this can't end as horribly as it does. And I was completely blown away by how that scene played out. I was uncomfortable, especially given what's going on in America right now and across the world. So that's just, it was a little weird, struck as sort of a strange note, but there's that the frustrating thing, and we'll talk about this, I suppose, about the criticisms surrounding The Last of Us, is that it's kind of, people are trying to put it into one box, or they're trying to, it arrives with the weight of all these expectations that this is, like, we are sort of burdening it with the Schindler's List level of this is a prestige game. That means it's going to do everything right. And so I don't want to sort of miss the forest for the trees. Like, yes, there's a lot that we might say is problematic, but there is a lot to be said for having two female characters as arguable hero and villain, two protagonists, antagonists, and then obviously the switch roles. I remember even like the trailer for Star Wars The Force Awakens got a lot of acclaim because Rey has a line where somebody's like, "Who are you?" And she's like, "No one." And like, that's a classic like Clint Eastwood sort of line that is usually reserved for men. And so that was 5 years ago, and now we have The Last of Us Part 2, where we're almost like, it's not shocking to us that this would happen. But I think it's still worth mentioning that it's cool, and I certainly appreciate it. And for you, I imagine like the announcement that you were going to play as Ellie was just like, you could sort of see into your scrying orb that you would have a video podcast where behind you would be a statue of Ellie.
There she is. Yeah. I think even, I guess before it was announced, when we did that episode, I was like, I bet you probably play as Ellie in the next game. So I was very happy to play as Ellie, and I ended up liking playing as Abby too. It's two different experiences, but it's great to see female lead characters. I chose to play as Cassandra in Odyssey. I love Tomb Raider. So in a genre that is dominated by men, and sometimes you just have the options of, isn't this kind of like Mass Effect, where it's like it's Shepard, but it's really just like the male and the female, but now they're becoming more distinct if you choose, and that, so I feel like it was great.
And also the male characters in The Last of Us are also really interesting and layered. I especially liked Tommy in this game. I think that he has a really subtle and quite tragic arc, which we can talk about later. But
absolutely. Yeah. And if the Salt Lake crew, if you look around that cabin, practically all the races are represented, which is great. You've got an Asian man there. You've got a Hispanic man there. Nora. And so that was good to see. Okay. Accessibility. This is something that people might not know as much, but apparently it's one of the most accessible games ever, in the sense of, if you have maybe a disability in terms of hearing or vision, you can cater your game play to that. And there were so many the first time I booted it up and played it, you have to go through several screens of options of how you want it to roll out. Is this the future of gaming right here, to have it accessible to people who potentially in the past couldn't have played? And did it work? Did you change any of the features? There was one feature I saw an article on, that you could change the color of different people. Now it completely changed the color, so I didn't do it because you couldn't see any of the backgrounds or anything, but villains would be like red and you would be yellow. So you could see everything in those sorts of things, but it sort of grayed out all of the backdrop. But for people who might be vision impaired, that's great that they can finally play a game, which is great. What do you think about all of this?
I think there have been testimonials speaking to that point, and it's been very well received. So I think that this could be kind of the gold standard for accessibility in games. I actually work in the accessibility industry, as you can tell by my hat, not really because I covered up the logo, but yeah, and so, but we work in like broadcast television and things like that, where it's mostly captions, and other departments are just descriptive video. With video games, it becomes a bit more complicated because part of the experience is challenge, and so how do you sort of modulate accessibility with the challenge? That was the conversation around Sekiro: Shadows Die Twice, which you mentioned at some point in an earlier episode, I think, where famously that game inspired one of the great memes where somebody, I think on like Games Radar, was like, oh, why isn't there an easy mode on this game? Like I installed a mod, and so that was the only way I was able to play the game. And somebody on Twitter was like, not only did you cheat the game, you cheated yourself. And like that big just blew up because it's so ridiculous. And so there's definitely that contingent. But there's games like Nier Automata, which you can, I think one of the modes is like just like it really reduces the gameplay, and so you can just sort of experience the story. Mass Effect has modes like that. And so it's like, what is a game? Is it those moments where you're like so frustrated because the dogs can pick up your scent, or is it the cutscenes, or so an ongoing conversation? But I think that this game represents a really, really certainly a concerted effort, which I appreciate just generally. But yeah, I mean, it's going to be different for every game, though, of course.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it did get to more than just visual and hearing purposes. It also got to how much does your NPC co-character help you out and things like that. So it really, I mean, you could really change and craft your gameplay experiences as you see fit. So yeah, you're right about that. Yeah, because I guess up to then, like Assassin's Creed Odyssey, I think, it would say like easy for people new to adventure games, and you're just more about the story than other thing, that kind of thing. So this is good. I think potentially it'll reach out to more people maybe, and bring more people into the fold. Who knows?
That would be great.
So connecting then to difficulty, changes to the non-playable characters and the infected, and then we can go into the bestiary, which I know you're excited about. Do you feel like this game was more difficult than the first one?
By orders of magnitude, I'd say. Donovan, don't even bother.
It's not
Yeah,
even finished with the first one.
I
Give me a
know.
break.
You can't even listen to this podcast or watch the video. Yeah, I found this game really difficult, which I was not expecting. And because, in a stealth game, you kind of want to try to avoid people or do those 6 takedowns. And I just could not pull that off ever. Like there were just so many obstacles to that goal, whether it be the dogs or just I have no idea who's looking at me right now. And so like the human stuff, like I was pretty much like, all right, at some point I'm just going to have to start shooting people. And I was out of ammo constantly in this game, which was surprising and not my experience with the first one. And then with the zombies, they have basically just one enemy type that just messed with me, which were the stalkers. Especially when they would burst out of the wall, which got me like every time. And that was most of my swearing at the TV. But you just have these things that like just knock you out of cover or engage you.
Yep.
And so I was like, I don't know what to do, especially since Abby doesn't have landmines, which was like amazing. Like that was so fun to like just know that they went off like somewhere elsewhere in the room. But yeah, I found this game quite difficult. But I don't know. How did you respond to the difficulty?
I think so. I was actually getting really nervous just with all the gameplay that I was seeing. I thought, am I going to be able to do this? And I don't like games that are what seems to be impossibly hard. So Sekiro: Shadows Die Twice seems impossibly hard. Any of the Bloodborne business, like anytime that people are like, I can't beat this game, I don't want anything to do with that, because then you're just frustrated and not enjoying the experience. I feel like I actually did better than I thought I would, and that maybe it's because I have grown as a person who plays games, or maybe because I had just played the first one and so I was getting into it. I do agree that it is more difficult. I think the infected are smarter They're more capable. And I won't say that I didn't die, because I certainly did. And when I played New Game Plus, I died more than I thought I would have in certain situations. I don't know, why step up the difficulty? Do you think it's just because it's, a new generation, it's the second one, so of course we've got to make it a bit more difficult?
It's hard to say because I have to imagine that my experience was relatively unique. It's not really a word that you qualify, but because I was, I mean, I guess the purpose would be kind of like to attain a kind of friction with the experience that Ellie is just like up against these overwhelming odds. Um, but yeah, I mean, and so the difficulty led to a lot of situations where I was really up against the wall, and throwing everything I had, which maybe made it a more complete experience in a sense, because I feel like I was doing a lot of hoarding in the first game, because it didn't present that same challenge, so I didn't have to upgrade all my weapons and everything. Whereas in this one, I really felt like, oh, I need maximum health, which I don't think I even got. And so there was more a feeling of desperation, which I think is a net positive.
Yeah.
But obviously, to get there, it was quite frustrating.
Yeah. Perhaps to build into you being Ellie, like that's how she would have
Right.
felt. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. The dogs added a dimension. Certainly that made it difficult. I felt like overall, any of the people you're going against were wiser. The infected, the clickers, it took me a while to figure out, because I thought, I'm crouched, I'm not making any noise, what's
Right.
happening? But then I realized that because the first game, I don't think they did, unless I'm remembering incorrectly, where they stop at moments in their path and then sort of scream out. And then I
Yeah.
realized, oh, this is like their echolocation. So if I'm not
Yeah.
behind something, they can see me. So that took a while. Stalkers were rough, because I think they
Oh,
only occurred twice in the previous game, and they were dotted throughout. And yeah, you can't really stealth them, and you can't really hear them as well, and they sneak up on you and go crazy. It's rough. It's rough. And
mm,
you're right, they pop out and then everything goes to crap,
yep.
because now
The
everyone's
clicker's
coming
gone.
at you. Yeah.
Yep. Um, but you do have at least one more tool, which is the dodge mechanic, which is when
Yeah.
I saw that, I thought this game is going to be hard. Like that was what I thought of,
Yeah.
because that reminded me a lot of the Souls game, where it's all about timing and twitch reflex. But the segment where that first comes into play with Abby in the winter sequence, I was having a lot of fun with that actually. Where you had the World War Z zombies coming at you and you were like dodging. I was like, ooh, this is great. But yeah, I think that was cool, and it definitely helps you with mobility. But yeah, it was just the stealth segments were just very difficult.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, but you certainly have a lot of tools to deal with these things. The mines were just that. Yeah, to reiterate, those were just a lot of fun.
Yeah. I missed initially I can't remember what they're called now, but what Bill gives you, where you can throw them. So they're kind of like mines, but you could throw
Mm,
them and they would blow up. Because the mines, you have to be strategic where you put
right.
them. But it worked out in enclosed areas, because you could protect yourself by putting them at entrances. And so if infected were to come, then hopefully you would be far enough away to not get killed with the blowback, which happened to me a couple times. And then, your characters near you were actually helpful as well, because Dina, I think, did a pretty good job helping me out, and Jesse to a certain extent. So that would, and then Lev, though Lev would always be, I got one, which is always
Yeah.
interesting. Okay, thank you. So that was good. So let's talk about some of these infected, uh, which is, yeah. So this was the reason why I wouldn't want to play the first game, is because of this stuff and the horror aspect. But now that I've played it and loved it, and I played Resident Evil 2 and have enjoyed that, then we get to this, and there were 4 types that we were aware of from the first game. You've got your runners, your
I guess runners, clickers,
runners, stalkers, right?
oh,
Clickers,
stalkers.
and
Yeah.
yeah, I couldn't remember the order. And then your bloaters, which were the dangerous ones. And then in
Yes.
this game, we have the shamblers, which are like a mini version of the bloater, but still very vicious. And then the rat
The
king, which
Rat
we'll talk about.
King.
But the shambler, what did you think about this guy?
I had no idea how to deal with a shambler. I could never figure it out because he can see you or sense you or something. So I was just like, I guess the idea is to stealth all the other infected so that when you go, one-on-one with this dude and there's nobody else around. I don't know. What was your shambler strategy? I think I asked you this at some
Yeah,
point.
so shamblers, it seems to me, are similar to clickers in that they will roar in order to
Yeah.
get a sense of what's there. So you could still stealth around them. I would use my Molotovs a lot.
Hmm.
And then depending on if I had it planned out, I could lay a trip mine and lead him. Because after you throw a Molotov, he would come after you and then get
Yeah.
it. But otherwise, yeah, then I'd just be shotgunning him and running away as much as possible. He's similar to the bloater, whereas the bloater throws things, he like gets close to you and like puffs up. And
Yeah.
even his final death blow, he's on
Yeah.
the ground dying and he will blow up his acid spores. So he was rough, and it was the worst when there was like two of them. You got to deal with
Yes.
two of them at the once wasn't enough. Please give me a break. Yeah, so there were a couple times that I could stealth around them and not have to deal with them, but otherwise, yeah, I just would be prepared with all sorts of big big weapons to take them down.
And just the nature of the resources in this game, you really feel every bullet that you throw
Absolutely.
at these things, because you pick up two bullets like at a time. You open a drawer and there's two bullets in there. It's like, oh
Yeah.
boy, two bullets. So yeah, it's hard to throw these things away, but you
Yeah.
can't. There's no stealth option for the shambler.
Yeah. Um, Yeah, it's not as bad as Resident Evil 2, which had its inventory management is a huge part of the game, but certainly you've got to be wise about it. And I did like at least that you could craft arrows as Ellie,
Yeah.
and you could craft certain types of ammunition as Abby. So at least that was helpful, but you've got to have the materials ready. And then we get to the Rat King, which I warned you about. I almost
Yes.
regret warning. I was like, what if I hadn't told him at all? But it's probably the hospital is one of the most horrific sections of the game, in my opinion. And it is just living there. I can't remember if it's like an emergency ward, or if it was the back of an ambulance or something. But when the power is off, you can try to open the door. It's obviously not going to open, but you can hear like a rumble. And she's like, what was that?
Yeah.
And then the power goes on and you make your way back. And now that door has been crunched open and you look inside, it looks like a uterus. And you're
Yeah.
like, this is not going to be good. So it's almost a suspense of yikes, this is not going to be good. You're following this blood trail to a garage. You finally get what you've come for, and here it comes. And it's horrific. So I would say that it's like what's it, the huddle? Is that what it's called? The huddle in
Sounds right.
Inside,
Inside.
mixed with, yeah, William Birkin, one of those stages from Resident Evil. But it is all of these creatures. I don't know why it's called the Rat King, but it is rough. And at one point during the boss battle, and you're Abby, I wonder what it would have been like as Ellie to
Oh.
fight it. One of the pieces pops off a stalker side of it. But yikes, what did you think about, the tension leading up to this, seeing it, actually experience it? The Rat King.
Well, well, of course, I had the extra tension of you having told me about it.
Hey, at some point you're going to find a new
Yep.
one, but I didn't tell him where. So there's like no spoilers. The only spoiler
Right.
was there's a new one coming.
And I was keeping myself from looking it up because that would have just ruined it. But
Yeah.
yeah, very effective build up. Because you're alone in that
Mm.
section of the hospital, and of course your goal is to turn on the power, which you know what happens when you do that.
Yep.
And yeah, you see it, or you get sense for it, and then it finally reveals. And I was also reminded of the creature in Zygote, which is a Neil Blomkamp short film with
Mm.
Dakota Fanning, I think,
Oh.
where it's this creature made up of bodies, very like The Thing style. And I think it's called the Rat King because like it doesn't really that doesn't sound right when you look at it. But I guess when you have like a huddle of rats like in a box or something and you pick it up, they can sometimes like all get stuck together,
Oh,
which is
okay.
horrifying.
That
And
is horrifying.
they have a feature where you can like you earn like Last of Us bucks and you can spend it on like unlockable concept art. And so I looked at the 3D model for the Rat King, and it's a really kind of heart stopping creature design. Because like that's kind of my favorite part of like science fiction. Like I want to see the monsters. If I wasn't too much of a scaredy cat, I would have played those Resident Evil games. But that's when I like zombie games, when they have like big monsters. But at the same time, I understand that it's kind of I understand why it would be difficult for them to do something like that. And I was surprised to see a creature like this. And narratively, it's because this hospital is where essentially ground zero for the city happened. So they just sealed it off, and all these infected just sort of coalesced, which is really cool. But like, there was an article, I think it's on Eurogamer, talking about the development of the game BioShock, which is seen as a very early example of like a prestige crossover game. And there's a moment where they're talking about the bestiary, essentially, what kind of enemies we're going to have in this game. And their reference point was System Shock 2, which was an earlier game where they had robot ninjas. And they kept talking about the robot ninjas. And the lead designer, Ken Levine, trying to make a serious game, was like, I don't want to hear about the goddamn robot ninjas. Like, we're making a serious game. This is literature. And so I feel like in the first Last of Us, I was kind of disappointed by the variety, because it was pretty much just like runners, clickers, bloaters, and I guess stalkers. Like, I don't remember that part. But in this game, it was a little bit more. But I feel like they're holding back a little bit, and I understand why, and I appreciate that. But I like monsters.
Yeah. Yep. And it's interesting because some of them, it's clearly development or years spent. So the runners are like a recently infected, and then it goes up and up and up. Shamblers is a bit of a question mark because they're so similar to bloaters, and no one from the Jackson crew had seen them before.
Right.
So it's like, how are they before or after? Is it something with this weather? Which one artifact that you find has said that maybe it's all the rain and stuff? And then, yeah, so I think the Rat King seems to be a one-off, that it was just that
Yeah.
particular situation because they leave that. But you do wonder, I mean, there's gotta be, just the sense of nature, and nature is crazy, or as Ellie says, nature is an asshole. When she and Dina are there, that there's got to be more. And I'm glad that there were at least 2 new ones, and that even though I hated them, that they used the stalkers a bit more, because I think they only occur twice in the first game. But yeah, I remember Neil saying that Shamblers are a new group and there's something else we're not seeing. And I'm progressing through the game and I'm like, what is this other thing? And there's a moment when, as Ellie, you fall, because I think a clicker or something came at you, or I guess it was a stalker. And so you fall into the river and you go into the sewers. And if you spend longer in the sewers than just like racing out of there, you can hear something rumbling. And so I feel like there's something else big down there.
Yeah.
And I was really nervous. I thought, oh, this is it. This is what's going to happen right now. It's like when you were Claire Redfield and you got to fight the stuff down in there. But it didn't happen. But the Rat King, I mean, it was sufficiently gross, disgusting, and horrifying. So I'm happy that we got to encounter that for sure.
Yeah, I mean, it's a zombie game, but it's also kind of a body horror game, because the central conceit is that it's kind of dumb. It's like a fungus, but
yeah,
the way it kind of interacts with the human face is just horrifying. I mean, clickers are really something to behold. And even just as an element of gameplay, it's always like, to me, the quintessential Last of Us moment is when you're sneaking up on a clicker, because there's just that moment of sustained tension where you just don't know what's going to happen. And then to finally grab it, you're like, yes, but it's horrifying. It's like, click, click. And it actually, towards the end, when it kills the rattler, when it's hanging, it's like, wow, it's really cool. So they do a lot of cool things being infected.
They sure do. Do you think if they made another one, that there would be pressure to another game, that there would be pressure to do a couple more new types?
I think that would make sense. But also, I wonder, I mean, you could probably do a Last of Us game where it was more people focused. I think if they wanted to scale down a bit, that would make more sense. But yeah, I mean, I'm always up for more monsters.
Absolutely. Well, moving on. So we're kind of heading towards the end of this particular section. So I do want to talk about the music, which, number one, it's just the overall soundtrack is really beautiful by Gustavo S., as I will say, and then with Mac Quayle. But also just the guitar itself and music is a character in this game as well. You pick up the guitar and you play it a couple times, random guitars that you find places, which I found amusing. Just like you've got a mission, but you do have time to
Yeah.
play the guitar. And then, of course, the Future Days song just repeatedly coming back. Was this successful in having these guitar moments and having the running theme of Future Days?
I mean, I think it was a good way to say without saying anything, to express the connective tissue between Joel and Ellie. You know, every time she picks up a guitar, she's obviously thinking about him. But I think is clever, and the fact that you have this sort of mini game essentially. It's not quite Guitar Hero, but you're
Yeah.
sort of strumming along with the touchpad. It was interesting. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, the use of music in the first game was really memorable to me. Obviously for the very distinctive score, but just the very last note of the game where she says okay and it goes into, I think the song is called The Path, which is the end credits theme. It's not so dour. It's almost kind of upbeat, and it really just it kind of accentuates that gut punch. And so the ambient music in the game is as effective in as far as, I honestly don't remember it. It was invisible, the way that like good editing in a film is invisible. So yeah, I guess effective use of a soundtrack as well. This was something that appealed to you. I get a feeling, especially.
Yeah, I really liked it because, well, being able to interact with the guitar is nice, but having that Future Days, I think for me, it was a continual gut punch, which in
Yeah.
the end made me physically ill. But I liked how it continued to connect through. And it also, I think, highlighted the fact that Ellie is so similar to Joel in that she can't talk about her feelings, but that is the way that she's able to show us her feelings in playing just the first few chords of that. And then even at the end when you're strumming and you've got some dead notes going on because you have lost two. I love Gustavo's his score, and you even have some pieces come back from The Last of Us. And I would also say like the atmospheric, which Quail I think was mostly responsible for, really heightened some of these moments for me of just, it sounded like a heartbeat, but it was just like this thrumming, this throbbing sound, or just some of these really intense moments where I think I mentioned this in one of my diary episodes. It reminds me of The Shining, the film, where Danny is riding on his tricycle through the halls. And the first time this happens, there's this eerie music and you expect him to encounter something in the corner, but there's nothing there. So it's like, it's heightened, but for no reason. And then the second time it does happen, but I'm like heightened because you're Ellie, you're in the hospital or wherever you are. I'm expecting some bad stuff to go down, or even this really intense music when it's saying press square to beat or I suppose just torture Nora to death. So some of these really, I think, amplified some of these intense character moments. Whew, yeah, and I have, because I got the particular collection that I got, I have the digital music on my on it downloaded on the PlayStation, so I had been listening to
Nice.
that as well. But it's interesting to go from Quail to Gustavo because they are very different from, I would say mostly strings to I I don't know, keyboards and things like that. So it's pretty interesting. But yeah, I just feel like music is so huge in this particular game. Whereas while I love the Assassin's Creed Odyssey, singing as your Greek troops on the ships, or God of War, some of that, or even Horizon Zero Dawn, I think there's just something very particular about this music here, and it adds to it. Some other details um, that add to I don't even know how to really phrase this, but um, this game for me was a lot about the details, something that I think they really honed and did a great job and evolved from the first game. Just like gun upgrades, like when you're actually upgrading, they're actually doing stuff with the particular parts. Whereas I don't really remember that in the first game. I felt like you just slapped your gun down and then something happened. As I said, I spent a ridiculous amount of time turning the camera around and looking at faces. And depending on what the conversation was or the situation, their faces would be showing that. I pushed Abby to the ledge so many different times, and the screen would like almost fish eye in, and you would feel that nausea or vertigo, and she would have this really intense look on her face. And then artifacts as well, and finding those and getting stories about people, learning a bit more about the wolves and the seraphites. How do you, I mean, was this all successful? Do you think artifacts are a bunch of like, it's just collector stuff, it doesn't really add to anything?
It's hard because I don't imagine that it's the main writers who come up with all of that material. And I just have this weird compulsion where it's like, well, I got to pick it up. And I read through it all. So
Yeah.
that's weird. Yeah, I don't know. I guess I could kind of go either way on that sort of thing, audio logs and other games. But yeah, just, I mean, just the sheer amount of detail in this game. And you're right, like that is such an important vector. And it was for me in the original game, because I was so struck playing The Last of Us, how tactile the world felt, the way in which your character moves through the space. One of the even revolutionary things was that when you walk upstairs, there's a different animation loop than when you're just walking on solid terrain, which is not something that a lot of video games have done or do, I guess. And so you really felt a part of this world. You really felt like you could get a sense for what everything felt like. And in this game, like even, yeah, just the upgrading the guns, like they do some clever camera work where you don't see exactly
Yeah.
what's going on. But it's very like the sound design is incredible. If you're like a Second Amendment gun nut, I mean, this is like pornography for you. So not that
This
I
is
want to
the game
encourage
for
that.
you.
Yeah, exactly. Yes. But yeah, I mean, that is such a big concern. I actually did not end up pushing Abby too much to the ledge because I'm not a sadist.
I just wondered what would happen. I just noticed the breathing so much in this game. And I thought, did
Yeah.
this happen the first one? But as Ellie, when you're in the aquarium and like she's just heavy breathing, I thought, oh my gosh, this is making it intense. And then Abby, if you push her, she's like,
Yeah.
I thought, yike, this is crazy what's happening here. So it's just little things that, again, you could miss, but I was just investigating everything. And I just appreciate that detail that, hey, what if the player does this? Then do we have um, some sort of outcome for them? So I like that.
Yeah.
I have this our present as their history, and this comes in a lot with Lev and Abby. The fact that what they discuss now and what they talk about is stuff that, of course, we know, but it's in the past. And I guess as Abby, who, Lev asks her, would you just pick up? And Abby says a quarter, and Lev says a quarter of what? And she scoffs and things like that. What responsibility do these characters have, do you think, to talk about stuff that has happened? So Abby with Lev, and then even when I went into that queer bookstore, Dina was saying, what are all these flags about? And of course, we don't really know. So it's what sort of, I don't even know what sort of question to ask with this, but I just think it's an intriguing idea of you almost have a clean slate to potentially start off with. You'd think it'd be a world without homophobia, but we've got our character like Seth or the Seraphite, so not necessarily. But maybe, what responsibility does someone have in like Abby telling Lev, or do you kind of just go on and create your own history?
I mean, I think that when it comes to characters like Seth or the Seraphite leadership, those are like adults. And in this game, you really see how younger generations, people born after whatever disaster, when that happened, how they're sort of adapting to the world. I mean, even Ellie in the first game, she didn't understand the girl's diary.
Mm.
But I also think when it comes to like The Last of Us Left Behind, that there was maybe a bit more of an idea that there was education going on and maybe perhaps history. And as you sort of rebuild society in a new image, you start to lose that, which I think is okay. But certainly you have to sort of like teach or properly contextualize the problems of the past, and so that you do not repeat them. And I think that kind of comes down to individuals like Abby. And so I am optimistic that she is going to be a good mother figure,
Yeah.
but we will see.
Yeah, absolutely. I think those are almost some of the funniest moments.
Yeah.
I often wonder, I was thinking about this last night, that I wondered if it would get annoying for Abby at any time of
Yeah.
certain things, but it seems like, especially in Santa Barbara, when they're looking for that particular house and Abby says, "We're getting warmer," and Lev says, "I hope not, I'm already sweating." And Abby's like, "Oh, you goober." And Lev's like, "What?" So I think it's, yeah, more endearing than anything.
Mhm.
And it helps, I think, maybe sometimes to like look back and be like, "Oh yeah, there was a time that such and such happened." As long as it's like positive, I think that could be a fun thing to do. But I just find it interesting that, yeah, all this stuff that we have now would be their history. And so how did they deal with that? And some things they wouldn't even know about potentially. So, gosh, civil rights, will there be a time when they don't know that that's happened?
Oh, yeah, I know. Well,
That's
I
tough.
think we forget sometimes too.
That's true. And I guess maybe the idea is that with this pandemic, like everything is normal. It's just all these
Right.
people. There's not really a difference between anyone. So that would be the hope with that. I've encountered it, as a teacher. It's and teaching for 10 years, I guess the past couple years I was teaching students that were born after 9/11. And
Wow,
so
yeah.
that's like super weird to think about, of like, oh, now you have to teach that in history class because they didn't experience it. So
It is history
I know,
now.
man alive. Okay, three more things here, and then we'll take our second break. So I have been thinking about this recently, especially with my second playthrough. What does mourning, mourning, look like in this world, and burial as well? And so, I guess to give you just to frame it and give context. So obviously with Joel, there was mourning for him. I don't know how many days, but not very many. I don't think she's ready to go. And he has a burial plot, which was great. But then I think well, Jesse, maybe, who knows? But with Abby and those people, I mean, she goes off and Mel and Owen are there. And there was someone else. Oh, Yara. I mean,
Yeah.
so I just wonder, like, what is the place for that? Do you just leave these fallen soldiers there? um I don't know, have you thought about this at all?
I didn't until you mentioned it. So I think that, Joel having a plot is kind of reflective of Jackson as a settlement. Because even today, looking at the pandemic, like it's difficult to even logistically organize mourning. You hear a lot of stories about bodies being piled in trucks and things like that. It's just like, God damn. And so in the case of Abby and all the death of her friends that she experiences, she just has to keep moving,
Yeah.
which is really sad. So yeah, I mean, it's interesting then that you kind of have Joel up front, where Ellie can take the time before sort of going out, whereas you contrast that with Abby. She can't take that time. She's got to
Yeah,
keep going.
it's just a bummer, thinking as a classicist and thinking about their view, the Greeks and Romans view of the underworld, and that being properly buried is a respectful thing to do, and that's the way that you're able to cross over the river. But if you're
Mm-hmm.
not, then you've got to wait there for 100 years. And so, yeah, especially when Manny gets shot, and then
Oh,
she's just thrust into that combat and going, and then she comes to Owen, whom she is still in love with, I would say, and just leaving him there, it's really hard. And then for Lev, that Yara is there, and there was really no way, like there could have been a way maybe for Abby to bury Mel and Owen. But with Yara, I think there was absolutely no way, given that situation on the island, and that how hard that must have been for
mm-hmm.
Lev. And there's a moment where I feel like I saw it. I don't know, maybe it was something that I'm pushing on the little NPC, but Lev looking at his hands because it was stained
Oh,
with her blood for the longest time. And so I just felt like, oh man, so what is the place for that? Especially for soldiers, you just leave that person behind, but these soldiers were something to somebody. And so it's just harder once you play as Abby, I think, than it is for Ellie, who's just leaving a wake of
oh my
destruction in her
gosh.
wake.
Yep. And I think Abby too is like a lot more militant than some of her compatriots.
Yeah.
And so, you know, she kind of reminds me of Joel in that sense, where in the first game, after Tess dies, like he just doesn't want to talk about it because
Yeah.
he's had to do this a lot, where he just kind of has to steal these emotions away. And I think Abby is kind of like that too, although it's not really textual, but
Mhm.
certainly a lot of those barriers come down over the course of the story.
Which is a good point. I wonder, it was probably Ellie that prompted Joel to bury Sam and
Henry.
Henry. Thank you.
Yeah.
I think you're right. Sam and Henry. Because she does make a mention of that. I mean, I don't think he would have done that on his own. He would have probably just walked
Right.
out of that building. Yeah. Yeah.
Hmm.
Interesting.
And there's also the element of the Seraphite leader character who is not specifically mourned, but her sort of image
Right.
persists throughout the whole Seraphite world,
Yeah.
which is interesting. There's certain rich, tableaus set up in her honor and things like that that you encounter.
Yeah, absolutely. How does this game showcase the evolution of Naughty Dog? I warned you that this would be where I flex my muscles, but
I see the floor.
okay. I just wanted to talk about this because I felt like in playing this, I have seen all of Naughty Dog's games. I haven't seen any Wampa Fruit, but you could collect an orb from Jack and Daxter, the precursor legacy. So that is there. But the rope climbing, the map and the mini open world, the conversations, everything seems to, with Naughty Dog, have been building to this. And so I feel like they've really, I don't want to say peaked because that assumes that we're on a downward trend afterwards. Right. But what I like about Naughty Dog is I feel like they keep pushing things. They keep pushing narrative options and gameplay options as well. And I think this is no exception. And the journal is something new. And I think that, in my personal opinion, it added a great deal because Ellie's not one to talk about her feelings, but she does write it down either in song lyrics or just little bits and stuff. So it's great to see that. So I feel like Naughty Dog continues to evolve. And this is, I saw a lot of Uncharted 4, which I think makes sense, honestly, Neil Druckmann's connection with that. But I guess that's all I have to say.
Aside from a new element like the journal, were you able to identify any other like building blocks experimented with in this game that you might see in the next Naughty Dog game?
Oh, interesting. I wonder if, it might be too soon for them, but I wonder if they'll work with role switching.
Yeah.
Because that was, I think, the one thing that's been very distinct. You have, of course, with the Lost Legacy side game, you played as Chloe, which you normally just play as Nathan. But with this, having a completely different character and switching over, I think it is something that was groundbreaking for them. So I don't know what that looks like in terms of other games that they're playing. Apparently, I'm getting blasts that apparently they're working on something big for the PS5. Who knows what it is? Or, is it a startup menu choice of play as this person or that person? But that's something that I could see working well. With Uncharted, it would have been fun to play as Elena. I can't really say that I'd like to play as Sam Drake or anyone else, but to switch with somebody else would have been fun. So I think that would be something that would be interesting, but I wonder if they're going to be gun shy with that, because that's how everything sort of sparked.
I know. I hope not. I hope that they recognize that artistically this was a good idea.
Yep, absolutely. And then last question is game as an art form. How does this game push forward the genre, or, how far would you call it art?
Oh man, this takes me back. This is like the earliest discourse about games, and it's complicated because you have various factions that you would not necessarily see yourself aligning with, sort of pushing for this games as art thing, while at the same time thinking so uncritically about games as art, games as text, because they don't like quote unquote mature themes of LGBTQ plus or anything like that, anything that sort of shakes the foundation of what they came to games for, which was not art. And that's fine, but a game like this, we see the effect it has on certain audiences, and you can kind of you get the sense that like in a lot of ways that audience has not evolved with the medium, which is just sad. But on the other side, this is one of those games that people will talk about with hyperbole, with great enthusiast sort of press, or even just on Twitter. You have people talking about how it's like Schindler's List. And so I saw at least one like cinephile guy sort of talk down on it, and be like, of course, oh geez, the gamers have their big important game. And so it's just like, it's on all sides. But as a game itself, I think it really does kind of accomplish something that not a lot of games have really done directly, which is really be that kind of empathy machine, which is what Roger Ebert talks about with movies. And I think that it kind of helps us move beyond a bit of a rut that I had been recognizing in games, where the point of a big important game in the last console generation was, don't you feel bad for playing this game? Shouldn't you have shut it off? Like Spec Ops: The Line, maybe Bioshock Infinite, things like that. And I think this is a lot different. And I think in that way, thematically, it does push the medium forward. But again, does one game have to sort of reflect on the entire industry? Because that's kind of how we approach things instinctively. And I think that kind of complicates all that criticism.
Yeah, I can see that for sure. And it's a lot to put on one game too. I wouldn't consider, well, my students will make fun of me and say, she's a gamer. I'm like, I've played games. Sure. I don't know. I don't know what the definition is, but I feel like it's disingenuous sometimes for someone to say like, it's just a video game, because I
Right.
think there are some that are like the recent God of War, which is very different from the old Kratos, or Marvel Spider-Man, or this one. I think is pushing video games in a very particular direction that makes it more art form. And it's just like comics. People say, well, it's just comics, but there's something,
Right.
they're deeper than that. I mean, it depends on what you're reading, of course, but I think there's certainly more to that. And video games are unique in the fact that while it could be a movie, like we could watch The Last of Us 2, just all the cutscenes, you are actively participating in it, and you might be sitting in a chair, but you are controlling your character. And I think there's something special about that. Beautiful and brutal in the terms of this one for sure. And then we had talked about, I think previously you asked, I think, my thoughts on speed runs, and I said I don't like speed runs because I think it disrespects the game as an art form, just in the sense of these people took this time to make this beautiful world that we are immersed in, so I want to enjoy it. So I think it at least pushes forward the genre in terms of storytelling. And I think it also inadvertently pushed it forward in terms of controversy and the culture surrounding it.
Yeah.
Because I think we are like, look at all of this stuff that happened, and look sometimes what leaks can do, and all of the terrible people coming from the internet and things like that. So it's had an inadvertent result from it as well, I would say.
Right. Yeah. And that's definitely important conversation. But again, I hope that it kind of dies off in time.
Yeah.
But at the same, I mean, Last of Us Part Two is not coming into the game space, or the same game space as the original one did. That game was such a moment. I feel like
Yeah.
we'd never really seen anything like that. Whereas in this game, I feel like there have been a lot of other contemporary games that have pushed the medium forward in their own ways. I think Doom 2016 really did a lot for like game feel. Something like Animal Crossing New Horizons for this year was all about like the social aspect of games. And so, games as a medium, it's difficult to talk about sometimes because they are so multidimensional. And so you kind of want to boil down The Last of Us to, oh, it's the story game.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe that is what it's pushing for mostly, but I don't think you can really take the interactivity out of it and have the same thing. I'll watch the TV show, but it will be different.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you think we'll get to a point where we don't really have any games pushing anything forward? We've sort of delved into all aspects of it.
Ooh, that's interesting. Um, I don't know. I mean, well, I think there's constant progress being made in all kinds of media, like in comics and movies even. So I think it's just a matter of like the creativity behind it. And as long as we have people like Suda51 and Yoko Taro and Neil Druckmann, you know, I think there's a lot of creativity in video games right now.
Yeah, I agree. Well, anything else on gameplay or overall things?
I actually, part of the difficulty for me was also just the controls. Like I had a hard time like remembering buttons, which is like, wow,
Sure.
am I becoming an old person? And even the swapping between weapons, like when you had to like, you know, click over twice and then hold down X and, oh, I want shotgun. I could never really pull that off in the heat of battle. So,
Yeah.
but you know, again, like how much that is on purpose, kind of a refrain for talking about this game. But you know, there was good frustrating and bad frustrating, I guess. And overall, you know, I'm here willing and enthusiastic to talk about it. So I enjoyed it, but I really like that first game for its gameplay. So
yeah. I will say, because I only played it on the PS3 Last of Us, and the controls are different.
Right.
Because I had played all 5 Uncharted's, and that's right trigger and left trigger for aiming and firing. And then I went over to The Last of Us, and it's completely different. It's L1 and R1 for that. And so that was crazy. And then when Donovan visited, and he's like, how do you sprint again? And I was telling him how to sprint, which was left trigger, I think, in PS3. He's like, I did that. That's not what it is. So they changed it for the remastered PS4 version, and then this one carried over. And I will agree with the weapons. What frustrated me is if something happened and I wanted to have a particular weapon, it would default to something else. So I could have it on, I don't know, the arrow or something, and then I might be crawling, or I got attacked. And then when I tried to fire, it would go back to my 9mm or whatever it was.
And everybody started chasing you. Yeah, that happened to me at least once.
It was too much for sure. Yeah. Oh, well, I guess that's it for gameplay then. Okay.
Yeah.
So we're gonna take our final break. And how are we doing? Oh well, I don't know. I knew it was gonna be a long one, so there we are. When we come back, we're gonna be breaking down the individual characters and looking at specific moments, or well, really the final moments of the game. But first, Zaius' Radio Hour again, featuring Simmer, which I think is thematically appropriate, by Haley Williams.